Turn to 1 Peter 4:12-19. If not, you can read with us on the screen. Verse 12. Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you're insulted for the name of Christ, you're blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer, or as a thief, or an evildoer, or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. This is God's word. Please pray with me. Our Father, as we go into your word, as we expound your word, as we seek to know what it means for us in our lives, we ask that your Spirit would move within this place, that he would be active in our hearts, that he would illuminate our minds. Lord, please give us wisdom. Please give us attentiveness. Help us to give attention and the time and the focus to your word, and that each and every person here would submit ourselves to it, trust in it, and love it and cherish it. We ask all of these things in Jesus' name. Amen. A few years ago, I was preaching through 1 John in the ministry I was serving at. And what happened was that up until that point, I liked to kind of do topical sermons where I would choose a topic that I was feeling confident in and like give my best sermon on those topics. But then our professors would encourage us to do expository preaching, preach through an entire book and see how challenging that is. And so I chose a really short book, 1 John. And at first, the first few chapters, I was feeling real proud of myself because I was giving everything I had into each sermon. And I was thinking that, yes, that was a good sermon. And I was trying to hit home runs every time. The thing is, I had forgotten that John likes to repeat himself in his letter. It's a letter about love. It's a letter about faith. He would talk about love in the beginning, and I would just expound everything I had on love. And then in chapter 2, he would repeat himself. And I had nothing more to say because I had already used everything I knew. And then what happened was, I couldn't continue that sermon series anymore because there was nothing more to say, because I had already used up everything I had. And so what happened was I kind of just quietly transitioned to another sermon series without telling anyone. I don't know if anyone noticed. But as we've been reading through 1 Peter, this entire letter is a book on suffering, as you guys have noticed. And Peter says similar things throughout the letter over and over again about suffering. And this is like the fourth or fifth passage that he is repeating and reiterating and re-emphasizing the Christian suffering experience. And I'm having cold sweat as I prepare the sermons because once again, I'm reading the passage and I feel like I've said everything there is to be said in my knowledge, according to my understanding. But then I went back and I realized I made some mistakes in the earlier sermons. In 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7, Peter starts talking about how Christian suffering is like gold being refined through fire. And I read my sermon on that passage, and I realized I said nothing about that, even though that was pretty much the main point of that passage. And I was kind of glad that I made a mistake. I missed that main point, because in this passage today, he actually brings that up again. He brings up fire and refining. In verse 12, Peter calls suffering fiery trials. And the Greek word he uses is purosis. And it's a similar word that we use when we talk about purification. Peter calls Christian suffering a fiery trial, purosis. And he's invoking once again gold being refined through fire, through the furnace. When you look at a metal ore, when you hold a piece of ore in your hand, what you are holding is a clump of metal mixed with dross, with mineral waste. When a miner, picks off a piece of ore and he brings it, this has a lot of value, but a lot of valuable things, but also a lot of waste, a lot of trash, useless stuff. And so when a smith takes a piece of ore and he's refining it, what is he doing? He is separating the waste from the pure metal. The reason smiths work with fire is because fire is what separates the two. Do you know what happens to the ore when it is thrown into the fire? The metal, what happens to the metal? The metal can withstand the heat. The metal is the pure stuff. It's the valuable stuff. Even though the fire is burning everything up, the metal can take it. It can handle it. What happens to the dross, the waste, the trash? That burns away. It's incinerated. What's happening is the pure stuff survives. The impure stuff fades away, it's burned away. In many cases, an impure piece of ore will most likely be completely gone after it goes to the fire because there was nothing pure, there was not much metal in it to begin with. A lot of times whatever goes into the fire will look a lot different from what comes out of it. And I think that's very true about Christians going through suffering. Suffering is not an if in the Christian life. It's a when. Jesus guarantees one thing, or many things, but he guarantees one thing over and over again to his followers. He says, if the master suffers, of course the disciple who follows the master will suffer. What is the ore in your life? When you are passing through the fire, when you are walking in a season of suffering, what is the thing in your life that is being refined? What is Peter trying to pinpoint in this passage? What is the metal ore symbolizing? What is the gold symbolizing? What is it in your life? Peter says, don't be surprised when you go through the fiery trial in verse 12. But if you look at this whole passage together in unity, the entire letter together as a whole, there's something specific that Peter is looking at. There's something specific about your life, about your person that he is pinpointing and saying that is the thing that is going to be refined when you pass the fire. Look at verse 19. He says, let everyone who goes through suffering entrust their souls to God. When you walk through suffering, let your faith be strengthened in God. In the verse I mentioned earlier, chapter 1, verse 7, Peter says, the tested genuineness of your faith is the thing that is more precious than gold when it is tested by fire. What is the thing that the metal ore is symbolizing when you are going through suffering? It's your faith. Your faith is what is being refined. What does it look like when it is tossed in? Is your faith mostly dross? Or is it mostly metal? Is there a lot of impurity or is it pure? What will it look like when it passes through the fire? Will it be completely incinerated and gone, or will it be perfected and purified? Peter is saying that you can't really know for certain what you trust in until you go through trials. And I think that's very, very true. For me, my idols in my life, until those idols are threatened, I don't ever think of them as idols. I think of them as nice things. Things that I enjoy. Things that I have alongside Jesus. I love Jesus. I love my family. I love my church members, my hobbies. my little gadgets and possessions. I love all of those things. I love Jesus. But when one of those things are threatened, when my family's health is shaky, when ministry gets rough and stressful, when my things get stolen or they break down and I don't have the money to replace them, then I start to feel something. I start to feel tensions. I realized they weren't just nice things that I had in my life. Those were things that I was trusting in. The human heart is like a big piece of ore. And there's a ton of different things attached to it. It's made up of different clumps of different things. And every Christian thinks that their primary faith, their primary allegiance is to Jesus. But when your heart is thrown into the fire, and when things start to melt away, it's only then that you're able to see what your allegiance was actually toward. When things start to melt away in your life, when things start to be threatened and burn away, how do you respond to Jesus? It shows in your response to Him shows where your trust truly lied in. For example, some of you guys, you love getting good grades. Some of you guys, you love your career. Let's say your academic career or your vocational career is being threatened. You're losing your job security. Your boss hates you and he is being passive aggressive towards you and he's giving hints that you're no longer secure. How do you respond to Jesus? Is your faith in Him shaking? Are you telling your church members when you're sharing in small groups, sometimes when I'm going through the things that I'm going through in my life right now, I begin to question God. I begin to question whether or not He's really active in my life, whether He really cares, or whether He's really there at all. I think that's the way many, many modern people respond to trials. And the thing is, that shows us that we never trusted in Him primarily in the first place. Our trust was in our career. God was simply a means to get a secure career. God, for many modern people, is your assistant. And when He fails to give you the thing you're really after, you fire Him. You question Him. Peter is saying you don't know what you really believe in, what you really trust until you walk through the fire. Sometimes Jesus will be the reason you might have to let go of something incredibly nice in your life. For example, I love going to certain cultural festivals and events. Like, those Japanese festivals? I love going to them. But guess what? Most of them happen on the weekends, and most of them happen on Sundays. So when I'm looking up, and when I'm really bored in my life, it's become super, monotonous, and I want something fun, I'll look for events, and I'll find one. And I see there's a whole lot of fun activities to do and a lot of good food. And I look up the date, I look at my calendar, and it's on a Sunday. And I'm thinking to myself, Jesus is the reason I can't go. And all of a sudden I realized that this festival was more than something nice to me. I get angry, I get frustrated, I get annoyed at the fact that Jesus wants me to come out every Sunday and worship Him and give Him that day solely to Him. That festival, that enjoyment I had wasn't just a nice thing that I had alongside Him. It was something that I trusted in for joy. And now my faith in Jesus is at odds with this. It's a very minor version, but that's a small trial. You know that you are going through a trial when the two things that you're trusting in your heart can no longer go together. Maybe some of you guys go through that. You love Jesus, or you think you do. You love this thing. You don't think you love it that much. But when you are going through a time in your life when those two things can no longer go together, you're going through a trial. How do you usually respond when something you trusted in is being threatened? Whether it's your grades, your friend relationships, they're moving away, or your plans for your life. Most of the time, as we mentioned earlier, we do a lot of complaining. We look at our trials as reasons against God. But look at what Peter says in verse 13 and following. Look at what Peter says, how to respond to the trials that come in your life. He says, rejoice. When you go through the trial, rejoice. Why? One of the reasons we can rejoice in trials is because it shows us, as we mentioned earlier, what our hearts really trust in. You will never be able to know yourself truly until you suffer. Do you know that? A Christian, it is impossible for a Christian to mature and to grow without suffering. So when you guys are suffering, and I know every single one of you guys have suffered, without that, you will remain the most immature, self-centered, infantile Christian there can ever be. Suffering is what shows what your true allegiance is to. That is one reason to be happy. You're seeing a reflection of yourself. But the second reason, the thing that Peter is emphasizing, is that trials are the best way to refine your faith. It is the best way to take the ore in your heart, burn away the dross, and to purify it, and to strengthen the faith you have in Jesus. This is in stark contrast to what we modern people think of our suffering. Whenever we suffer, that becomes the number. Look, you look up any testimony of a Christian who became an atheist. Any Christian who turned away from the faith and became an atheist, I guarantee you, 9 times out of 10, they did so because they went through a trial of suffering. I read a book on this person who was bringing a ton of apologetics, ton of reasons, ton of philosophies on why the Christian God cannot be real. In the first chapter, he said he watched his mom pass away from cancer. His father lose his job. All of his Christian friends, going through incredible suffering. And that was the reason he decided that God cannot be real. Peter is saying, no. Suffering is what refines your faith. It is not what destroys your faith. You need to see where your allegiances were. You need to use that to see how weak your faith in Jesus was. When you do that, your faith will strengthen. If you don't do that, it will be destroyed. In the Bible, read throughout the Bible and pay attention to how different people in different time periods, in different cultures, different genders, different age groups go through trials. You won't see many of them losing their faith after a season of suffering. You will not see that in the Bible. In fact, that pattern of suffering leading to atheism, leading to less faith, that is a completely new trend that we're seeing in our generation. And all it shows is how weak our faith was to begin with. Look at the classic examples. Joseph. Look at Daniel. Look at David. What happened to their faith after they went through a season of suffering? Have you been through anything comparable to what they've been through? In their lives, the trials burn away everything they have been trusting in and leave only one thing remaining. It is their trust in God. And that trust in God is strengthened all the more because of the fire that they walk through. It's the only thing left. And when they get there, what do? When they get through and in that fire, they're still going through suffering, they're still in torment, but their trust in God is being refined. What do? Read the Psalms. Do you know when the psalmist wrote those Psalms? It was when they were in the fire. And what are the Psalms? They are praise. They are worshiping God. They are rejoicing. They are changed. Before they went into the fire and after they went in, they're completely different. The impurities, the false trusts are gone. The dross is burned away, having been through the fire, and they come out with sincere trust in God. This, in turn, ends up giving them more security. Even though they lost a lot of the things they had, they are more secure. They are more joyful. Why? When I'm suffering, when I'm going through a really difficult time in my life, the things that I enjoyed before, the video games, the movies, the hangouts with friends, those things, I want to do them, but they no longer give me that sense of joy that they used to. It is now simply an escapism. I am not so happy when I'm playing video games when my life is a wreck. I'm simply escaping for a really brief period of time. But those who trust in God during their time of suffering, they testify with their own lips. You've heard their stories. They say they are filled with joy. Whenever the Bible talks about fire and trials and faith, it always seems to point back to that story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. You know, Daniel's three friends. Daniel's three friends, they're the only ones who remain faithful to Yahweh, to God, even when Nebuchadnezzar commanded everyone in Babylon to bow down before him. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused. And what happens to them? Everyone's like the other jealous guys, they say, oh, those three guys aren't worshiping you, king. How dare they dishonor your name? You need to execute them. And he starts roaring up the furnace. And the furnace gets so hot that the guards who are, tending to it, they get burned up. And he gives them one more chance to repent. They don't. They say, God will be with us. He will save us. But even if he does not, and even if our lives are destroyed, we have something that you will never be able to destroy. And we will still glorify God. They're thrown in. And we all know what happens. They're not burned up. No one dies in that furnace. But Nebuchadnezzar, he's looking inside. And what does he see inside that furnace? 3 people are supposed to be screaming and burning up, and his nostrils are supposed to be filled with the stench of burning flesh. But none of that is happening. He doesn't even smell anything burning, but he says he sees something. And the Bible is very specific in the words that Nebuchadnezzar uses to describe what he sees in that furnace. He says, do you not see a 4th person in there? One who is like the son of the gods. This was so mind-blowing to the Babylonians. To Nebuchadnezzar and all of his people, as they watched what was happening in that furnace, and as they watched this godlike figure joining in Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace, they were so mind-blown that after Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were released from the furnace, what happened? Every single person there bowed down to the God that those 3 guys were worshiping. In fact, it became like a national law to worship Yahweh. Why was that such a big deal to them? What was happening in the mind of Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians as they watched this God join in the furnace? Why was that so mind-blowing? It's because they had never heard of, imagined, they had never ever thought of a God that was so faithful to his people that he would join in, walk into the furnace as they were suffering, as they were facing potential death. That never, ever, ever crossed any of their minds. And when they saw that happening, all of them were moved. All of them started bowing down. Do you know why your suffering can never destroy you? As long as you know the things that Peter has been saying over and over and over again. Why did the fire not incinerate Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego? Why? Because God was trying to impress everyone? Were those 3 guys sinners? Yes, they were. Did they deserve to die? Yes, they did, because they were all sinners. Why did they not die in that furnace? Because there was a 4th person in there, And that fire and the heat and that furnace was saved for that fourth person. Jesus Christ became sin itself on the cross. And when he was hanging on the cross, the heat of that furnace was being poured out on him. The reason those three guys did not die was because Jesus was going to take their place for them. He became the dross. He became the impurity, the waste that would burn away. And he gave you the metal, the purity, the good stuff. The reason you will not be destroyed is because Jesus was burned away on the cross in your place. If you have never suffered before, none of this will ever ring, closely to you. If you never suffered before, Jesus' suffering doesn't connect. If you haven't felt so utterly helpless before, Jesus' offer of rescue doesn't mean anything to you because you don't think you need to be rescued. That's why suffering is considered a blessing. Your eyes are open to your true weakness. You are able to see how truly helpless you are, and you're able to respond properly to your actual state. That is why God says, when you suffer, rejoice. Suffering moves us to realize our need for the cross. And it opens our hearts to realize that God is there for us in the furnace. He's there so closely that he redirected the heat of hell to himself. When you see someone doing that for you, as Nebuchadnezzar watched this God do this for his people, even he was moved. When you see this God going in the furnace, burning away so that you would be refined and purified and saved, what happens? What do you gain toward that person? You gain a sense of trust. Your faith is built up. You trust in him. You see that he is not a God who is high and lofty and reclining on his throne up there. But he is a God who comes down and he will join you when you are at your worst, when you're going through your worst. And you trust in him. And your faith in him will never be inadequate. It's never empty. It's substantial. Because the one you're trusting in is different from all of the other things you've been trusting in all throughout your life. I read somewhere that a silversmith, the way they know when a piece of silver has been refined enough in the fire, has been purified thoroughly in the fire, the way they know it is when they take that piece of silver out and they're looking at it and they see their face being reflected on the surface of the silver. And much the same way, when you know that you are not alone in the fire, but Christ stood there with you, and he took the blunt of the heat on the cross, and he is refining you until your life is a reflection of his face. You can endure it. You trust in him. You can actually respond with more love than you had before you went in. So, this is finally the last passage we have on suffering. As we move forward, I encourage you to remember that your suffering is not a reason against God. It was never a reason against God, ever in the Bible. But it was a reason for God. People went and experienced suffering and they came out more purified, more refined, more strengthened in their trust toward him. When you are going through suffering and the other things in your life are burning away, it is important to realize that those things were the things that you were putting your faith in. They were the dross in your life. But he will remain with you. Let's pray.